permettrez de faire l'entrevue en anglais. On a plusieurs intervenants dans la salle qu'on a mobilisés pour l'entrevue. Je peux pas penser à une meilleure personne que Fred for this conversation. Fred is just the right person to come and talk about innovation and talk about the carbon removal issue. Before we dive into it, I spoke earlier and I said how committed BMO is to the climate question. A couple of things you may or may not know about BMO. This bank has continued to grow through North America. Last year we acquired Bank of the West in California. We're everywhere in California, the largest bank acquisition done by a Canadian bank in history. And why? Well, California is a place for innovation. And that acquisition has catapulted BMO to be the fourth largest commercial bank in North America. There's no other Canadians ahead of us. There's a couple of global banks and then us, commercial books. The heart of the economy are commercial businesses. So BMO is really, really focused there. And we're focused particularly on tech and on climate. And therefore, when you think tech and climate, Fred Lalonde comes top of mind. Fred is an entrepreneur that's been at it ever since he was 19 years old. Founded businesses, sold businesses at extraordinary successes. And founded a company called Hopper a number of years ago. Hopper is a business-to-consumer and business-to-business travel solution, software solution that's now a unicorn worth multi-billion dollars, still a private company. And Fred had his personal moment, clutch moment, where he realized the issue around climate. So Fred, first, thanks for being here. It's always a pleasure to see you. I'd like you to talk to the crowd here on your journey. So you were the founder and CEO of Hopper, accelerating in the growth, and then you had a realization moment.
Bonjour Grégoire, et merci de prendre le temps. Yes, so we sell billions and billions of dollars of flight at Hopper, and generally recognized as one of the bigger, more successful Canadian companies. And so as we were growing before the pandemic, and I don't think I'm the only tech founder to start thinking this way, out of sheer guilt, I started looking at what we could do. And I looked at the natural-based credits and all these offsets, and they just seemed too cheap to me to be real. So we built our own program to try to offset the CO2. So anytime you book on Hopper or you book on one of our partners, we plant a tree. We plant it in places where they matter. We mostly plant mangroves. I forced my data scientists to go to Kenya and take pictures. So we did everything that you're supposed to do, and we've never monetized it. We don't get credits. We don't have offsets. We just did it because it's the right thing. And today we have 25 million trees in the ground, and we're trying to get another 30 million in. And then I gave one interview about this to a 21-year-old climate reporter, and I got destroyed. It was super aggressive. I thought they were going to say, hey, you're awesome, you're saving the world. And of course, it's because of all the backdrop of greenwashing that big companies do. And in that interview, which felt like it lasted 7 hours, I realized I didn't know anything. I didn't understand what CO2 was. I didn't understand where it came from. I didn't understand what the warming was. And I felt like an idiot. So that was my moment, feeling like an idiot. And then I went in and I started reading on the science of climate change, trying to understand, what is the warming? I thought all the CO2 came from humans, which makes no sense. And this is one of the few problems that I have ever studied in my life where every time I learned something, it was like, well, that can't be right. What do you mean? That can't be right. And so I went down this rabbit hole where I ended up reading the science that underpins the IPCC reports and rebuilding the models on my laptop from the data that the IPCC collates. And I came to a very different conclusion about how much time we had when the problem was locked in. And I usually say this at the end, but I'll lead on this. I am definitely here to scare you today. If you've seen my talks, I have a very, very different view on what's about to happen and what it is. But it is not because something is going to be bad that we should give up. So just saying that something is a lot worse than we thought doesn't make you a pessimist. We're here to fight it, and so should you. But we think the problem is a lot worse. You think you understand this because you showed up for this conference, and it's great that you did, but you probably don't. no more than I did.
You and I have shared a lot of those readings, and as I said earlier on, I'm a geek. I'm a data geek, so I've been reading the same things you've been reading, having the same conversations, going up all the way to interviews with people at the IPCC. So the IPCC, for those who are less familiar, of course, is the United Nations, the scientists from all countries in the world that come to consensus and that publish their reports. And the last one was a year ago, and it was absolutely terrible. But you're saying the IPCC, you've developed a different view. So talk to us about your view of the carbon cycle, and specifically, where are we at in terms of carbon and other greenhouse gas accumulations in the atmosphere?
We've been focusing on the temperature change. The Paris Accords, the 1.5, and everything, I said this last year, but everything that's unfolded in the last year is actually way worse than the worst thing I was saying on stage. We've actually been past 1.5. If you've been reading the news and you have scientists that are wondering about this on like what happened, what's changing, and there's a lot of complexity around this, but if you look at it, the average temperature has been above what we've set as our target. And it happened, and Annelise was showing this, almost instantly. 22, 23. There was a surge and acceleration of this. And you can see this on the ice cover, which is actually terrifying. You can see it on the ocean temperature. They're talking about dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico this year where life will cease to exist. And let me tell you something, there's something called the food chain, right? If we lose the bees and the plankton, I don't know what happens. I'm not saying we know that that's gonna happen. I'm saying that things are accelerating. So the other thing that's happened, and these are not models, by the way, there's nothing behind me that's a projection. This is actually the data that you guys have been reading about in the media. The other thing that you can do is you can look at the acceleration. You can look at the curve if we just project it forward. What you see behind me is all of the spot data of the average temperature and the increase, and we've been seeing these charts. But if you take Photoshop and you add the 23 and 24 data points, we are going to slam through 2.5 degrees no matter what we do. So this is just a line, right? And so do I know that's gonna happen? No, but the last 2 years are telling us a very different story. Now, climate is a mean reverting system. So there's El Nino, it can get warmer for a few years, then it'll go back to a more tame average every 7 or 8 years. So with a little bit of luck, 25 will not be in this continuation. Hopefully I'm being alarmist by drawing this line. But in 7 years, guess what? It's the long-term trend that does this. And actually, this came out about a month ago. They surveyed the climate scientists and said, what do you think we are headed for, guaranteed, locked in? They surveyed hundreds of them, and the answer is 2.5. The people that have been studying this are saying there's no way we're staying under 1.5. So there's two questions. Why? And why are we so optimistic? Why are we wrongfully optimistic about this that we need to understand first?
Well, you may want to talk, I mean, these are the same scientists that are behind the IPCC reports. Why does this feel different than the IPCC? Talk to us about the consensus concept on IPCC reports and what happens if you try to get that curve inside consensus.
So it should be noted that this man actually called the IPCC and asked them this question. This is the only person that I know that did this. He actually called them and said, I want an explanation for this. And so this is a case where the scientific method that has basically gotten us out of the dark ages, it's allowed us to have cell phones and airplanes, is actually not playing in our favor. Because the way the scientific method works is you need to have verifiable, reproducible proof of something to say that is true, which is really, really good because the alternative is believing in aliens or witches. We really need the scientific method. But the problem is this is an exponential process, meaning it is accelerating and it is slow. An exponential process that's fast, like a pandemic, we're able to deal with as a society, as individuals, a little bit better. The problem is, by the time we have reproducible historic data that says the Earth is going to warm by 1.5, the IPCC says 10 years. It has to be there for a decade. It will be too late. And it's because of how CO2 works, and we'll get into that. Why is the IPCC data off? It's because it's a series of models. They have, I think it's 120, you actually know this more than me, and they do exactly—
It's over
what you
600.
do. They throw out the most optimistic ones, and they throw out the most pessimistic ones to find the consensus in the models, which for almost any other problem you would want to solve with science is the right thing to do. So in the IPCC data, and as I said, you verified this, there is actually an outcome that looks more like 2 or 3 degrees, but using the lingo they use, it's called very, very unlikely, meaning there was not enough historical data to back such an alarmist outcome until this year. So there's no world conspiracy. People aren't running around in cloaks funded by oil and gas trying to lie to you. It's just that as a species, this problem is harder to frame than we thought.
And to correct what I was saying, so it's over 600 scenarios that they use through the models. It's actually a bit less than 100 models that they have. A couple of those models, which are considered hot models, which show too high a temperature increase with given CO2 concentration levels, are indeed pushed out of the conversation that's in the reports. So that's a part that's always worrisome. That being said, it is a very rigorous process, and it is what the world and the economy can rely on, which is a great thing. It's an enormous asset that the IPCC reports represent. Now, this temperature change, Fred, so you've been at this, it's all about CO2 concentration. It's the accumulation. And as you say, there's a lag between the accumulation in the atmosphere of our greenhouse gases and the moment the temperature actually hits a new run rate. You've talked briefly about that lag. Tell us your findings on this, and tell us a little bit your findings on the CO2 cycle and the concentration level.
This is actually the real important part. And you can look at the curve that Al Gore showed, I think it was 2003 or 2006. So by the way, we didn't find anything. This stuff has been around. When you look at that curve, which shows you the historic levels of CO2, and I think this one goes back 1 million years. This is from the ice core data. We drill in and we pull it out. So if you're looking at a 1,000,000-year timeline, modern humans appeared at the latest 300,000 years ago. So there are no humans for most of this chart. And you can see that there is a natural cycle of CO2. And the people that were denying climate change were saying, no, CO2 was rising naturally before humans, which is actually true if you look at the green bar. But just use common sense. Look at where the industrial levels are, right? And I'm not the first person to show this. The point is, the Earth is not stable above 320, 340. Depending on how you feel about this, you can pick a different number. We are at 420. And actually, the rise this year in concentration was the fastest in recorded history since we've been capturing direct CO2 measurements in the early 60s. So it is actually accelerating. The concentrations are accelerating. Now, you need to know a couple of things about CO2, the molecule, to understand what it is. So it's not the only warming gas. Other things like methane do it. But methane gets destroyed pretty quickly by solar and cosmic radiation. So 12 to 15 years, whatever's up there goes away. It is a much more potent greenhouse gas, but it gets recycled quickly. CO2 will stay in the atmosphere for up to 10,000 years. And actually, the top 60% of it that gets put up there, we are stuck with for at least 300 years. So let's call that 10 generations. So what you are seeing now, the fires, the droughts, if nothing worsened, we have 10 generations of, even if we stop the economy and go back to horses, because it's already up there. Problem number one. Problem number two, the CO2 itself doesn't warm immediately. It's not like the CO2 is the warming effect. It traps solar radiation. So there is a delay. We don't exactly know what the delay is. It is somewhere between 8 and 50 years. If you use 30, which is generally a lot of the science community thinks that's the case, it will take another 30 years before the Earth warms accordingly to what's there now, not what we're putting up tomorrow. The third thing, and this is by far the worst bit of news I have for you, most of the CO2 is actually natural. You've also heard deniers talk about this, right? It's not man-made. Man-made emissions, about 4% of what's up there. But it circulates. CO2 is solvable in water. So what's the biggest thing that pulls out CO2 every year? The oceans. What is the biggest emitter of CO2? Single emitter, the oceans, right? Trees. Trees are made of CO2. What happens when there's a forest fire? It emits CO2 when they die and they fall in the forest. But trees also absorb CO2. So there's a natural cycle. We emit about 33 billion tons of CO2 industrially a year. It's actually going up. That's the measure right now. The Earth circulates about 750 billion tons a year. So the planet is emitting and recapturing our entire industrial emissions every 6 weeks. What happens if we break the natural cycle? Or more interestingly, what happens if we broke it? Which is more likely than not the case. Our emissions have been stably growing at about 2%. Why is it warming faster than 2%? The feedback loop. It is very likely that we were locked in to 1.5 before I was born. So, what do we need to do? We have to stop putting it up there, and we are, whether you like it or not, going to have to take it out.
In fact, there is no scenario in the 600 scenarios of the IPCC that doesn't say exactly that. We need to take it out of there. We need to reduce CO2 concentrations. There will need to be carbon removal in all the scenarios. So Fred, as part of your free time, I don't know how a CEO and founder of a tech business of the scale of Upper has that kind of time, but you decided not just to panic about this, but to actually take it to action. And you founded, a couple of years ago, Deep Sky Climate. And Deep Sky is trying to tackle this with a very different business model than most. So talk to us a little bit about Deep Sky and what you guys are trying to do.
And to be clear, I panicked quite a bit. I panicked for 2 years before doing something. So we are one of many carbon removal companies, but we approached the problem differently because I think we understood the actual problem differently from the beginning, which I just explained to you guys. So the first thing is, by the time we have done the industrial transition to renewable, and remember, you saw that chart, it's more than 50% fossil fuels. Coal is a third. As we sit here, coal is a third of what we're burning. So we will most likely be in the most optimistic model at 520 parts per million. That should terrify you. You should be freaking out.
Humans have never experienced something outside 280.
As a species, no.
As a species. And when I was born, it was 330. Now we're at 420, we're heading to 500.
We're at least at 520, right? And so that's if we do everything right, which we are starting to do very, very slowly. So at 520, you have to take out between 1.1 and 1.6 trillion tons, 1,000 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, right? So fundamentally, I just gave you a number that's so large, it's incomprehensible. The one thing I'll give you for scale, everything we make, put on a boat, a truck, and ship and buy in a year as a species is 8.8 billion tons. I just gave you a number of 1.6 trillion. So,
well, another way to think about it is we emit 50 gigatons of CO2 every year. We need to get to net zero. We need to bring it down to 10 and remove the rest. McKinsey says that's a 1.2 trillion revenue industry, that removal piece, annually, just to get to net zero. But then you're saying we need 1.6 trillion tons?
Yep, and a ton's a ton. When you take the gas and you mineralize it, like this stage would be 10 tons of CO2 if it was solid, like CaCO3 would be charred. Right? So this is actually the material we have to move. So you're gonna need a couple things. You're gonna need a place to put 1,000 billion tons of gas and compress it. Right? That has to be underground. You can't make nanotubes of carbon, you can't make vodka. All these projects that have secondaries to them, they're not gonna scale. That's problem number one. Two, the reason we burned all these dead dinosaurs is because it emitted energy, and the way that physics works is we're gonna need energy to draw it down. CO2 is a big, ugly, heavy molecule. Breaking the bonds is hard, capturing it on something is hard. And the issue is, to just take out what we've put up, we will need to double our energy, our renewable energy. So let this sink in for a minute. 50% is oil and gas now. We need to double our renewables just to do the transition. The sum of that, all energy on Earth, needs to double again to pull out this CO2. So you think we're getting out of this without nuclear? You haven't done the math. We should be putting in nuclear power plants everywhere. And that's not an opinion, that's not a political statement, it is pure energy math. So you need the energy to do it. And then third, you need technology. Now, unfortunately, we haven't built the technology. We were focused on the energy transition, which is a good thing, but we have not built anything. Today, we have factories that'll make TV screens, cell phones, cars, batteries. We have no factory on Earth that builds a unit to capture CO2. And we will need over 2,000 plants that are the size of a building in our lifetimes to have a shot at this. We don't have the manufacturing to do it. We don't know the technology. And technology-wise, we're actually in what's called phase one of the Utterback curve. So nobody's ever heard of this, but think of airplanes when the Wright brothers got it right. So everybody was trying to build an airplane. Guys were trying to do Leonardo da Vinci's helicopter. They were doing stuff. And the Wright brothers, they made bicycles, and they figured out they used cables to warp the wings, and they could turn. The problem wasn't flying, it was landing, because every plane would crash. When they figured out how to do that, they fixed a design. Then you get the shape of the airplane that carries over to World War I, World War II, commercial air flight. Now, the point is, nobody knows what a carbon removal reactor looks like. These container-sized things that you see on the internet, that's not gonna be it. So we are at a phase where we need to find storage, we need to allocate power, and we need to iterate through and fail as many technologies and as many designs as possible. Normally, just like the energy transition, this takes 50 to 100 years. We might have 10 to do it. So it's about accelerating.
So there's a number of companies in the world right now trying to develop the technology, both for ocean capture and air capture, trying to remove CO2. So you're meeting with those folks. You're not trying to compete and have an alternative technology, but talk to us about your pilot program.
This part's fascinating, and it's actually good news. So when we started this 2 years ago, there were 3 companies that had working CO2 capture technologies. There was one in Squamish, in Vancouver, these guys in Denver, a couple guys in California, one guy on a pier trying to suck it out of the ocean. And so we did a couple of things. One, we partnered up with the X Prize. So every time that a technology gets the $1 million prize bonus, we go in, we meet with the team, and we buy their first unit. Because once you've won a prize and you're trying to start a business to build something, you need a customer. So we show up and say, how much does it cost to make another one? And usually they're super confused about this question. And we're like, well, make us one. And they're like, what do you mean? Make another one. Here's $2 million, and we'll bolt it up in Canada, where we are working on establishing a site where we can put power, clean renewable power, and sequestration together. And then the balance of plant and the financing and all these other things you need to create a natural carbon unit. So when I started this 2 years ago, there were 3 companies plus 3 labs, and I went there and I met them. Like I climbed over a fence in Squamish, I thought we were gonna get arrested, and we just like looked at everything, we met with everybody. In the last 12 months, our science team has met with over 100 startups that have all these different membranes and tubes and towers, and some things are like houses, other things are like that speaker, and we're just buying everything that we think makes sense. On the premise that we need a technology that can take out a ton from the atmosphere under 1,000 kilowatt hours, because otherwise the energy budget doesn't work. Meanwhile, we're looking at drilling wells. We're looking at volcanic rock. So the Icelandic government started a thing called CarbFix, where they figured out how to store carbon underground. We're looking at deep saline aquifers in Bécancour. The good news, by the way, if you look at a map of Canada, Canada has that enormous pool that has the oil and gas, right? So that's evil, like this is terrible. Actually, that formation could store between 1,000 and 2,000 billion tons of CO2.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. Canada has the geological resources to reverse climate change for all civilization. This is just geological fact. The other thing we have in BC, Manitoba, and Quebec, we have enormous amounts of hydropower, which can be used to kickstart, because you're gonna need a lot of energy on these bad designs to get them to scale up. So what is Deep Sky? We are trying to build the first gigaton infrastructure that solves for storage, energy, and figures out which technology will be the design lock. the version of the airplane that we will scale, manufacture to 1,000, 10,000, 1 million units.
So Fred, we have a couple of problems. One is the concentration problem. The other one's the timer. We're over time. And we're going to have to come to a wrap. But over the last year, you raised $75 million to accelerate that concept of bringing those technologies, put them side by side, test them with renewable energy. Lots of learnings in this. As you think of creating a revenue stream for the credits, because it's negative emissions, so it'll be monetized through credits, what are you hoping to see in the next year or two in terms of catalyzing those markets, and what do investor corporates in this room need to do with when they think of the credit market?
This is actually a great way to close on this. Because you read that the nature-based credits have collapsed and the price is down, do not get focused on that. There will be a price for removing a ton of carbon. The problem is very, very difficult to create a market for the absence of a ton of something, right? We have markets for orange juice, pork bellies, but there are already companies, tech companies, industrial companies, banks that are starting to buy negative tons of carbon. Actually, it's way bigger than you think. And also look at the shape of that curve. That is also an exponential accelerating curve, which should make you feel good. This all needs to be brought into the mainstream. We need to figure out project financing. So how do you finance a $1 billion plant on technology that nobody understands, that you don't know how to build? We're also working on that. And fundamentally, regardless of what happens, because of the sheer economic damage that climate change is causing. And you can look at the insurance industry, like look at how much stuff is getting destroyed every year. There are no climate deniers in the insurance industry, zero, right? States are becoming uninsurable. So the projections that I've seen on this acceleration say that up to 1/3 of global GDP will be converted to infrastructure damage, private and public, in the next 30 years. So I can tell you something, a negative ton of carbon will be the most valuable commodity since the invention of money. And it sounds strange to bring it down to that, but we use money as a society tool to decide what we value. We can debate that, at the thing I'm doing after, if that's the right way to do it, but that's how the world works today. So it is very, very important that we not just build the technology, we build the financial infrastructure to scale this up. And that will happen through private, government, and innovation, I'm 100% sure. The thing that is on the table is how fast will we do it?
Well, the good news is we're on it. We purchased the firm Radical, which is one of the market leaders in the carbon markets in North America. So now Radical is part of BMO, hundreds of people in the carbon markets every day, because we believe exactly that. Carbon removal will be one of the largest, if not the largest industry in this world within the next few decades. And we hope to be part of it. And in fact, there's another way we think we can be part of it. Fred, I'm sorry to surprise you here, but I can confirm to you that we have obtained all internal approvals at BMO to become an investor in Deep Sky. So BMO is extremely pleased to catalyze your progress. So thanks again, Fred, for, as always, a very enlightening talk. And we hope to have you on this stage for the progress of Deep Sky in the next iteration of this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.